Hello everyone. Welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to take a look at question 6, Article 7, where Aquinas gets into concupiscence and its effect on voluntariness. Now the question of this article is very similar to the previous article. In Article 6 we asked if fear causes involuntariness, and now we're just going to ask, does concupiscence do the same? But before we do that, we need to disambiguate what we mean by concupiscence. That is going to be a particular problem, especially if you've been a student of mine before, where concupiscence has meant something very different than what it means here. But after you've made that clarification, this article is pretty easy. Does it work differently than fear? Well, it turns out it's already been answered in question 6, Article 1. So if you know the material we started this semester with, Article 7 is pretty quick. So to disambiguate, for all the years that you've been in the religion program at St. Anselm's Abbey School, and for those of you who are not my students, probably in other contexts as well, you've learned that concupiscence is our desire for evil caused by original sin. It's one of the effects of the sin of Adam in human nature. In the very famous treatment by St. Augustine, think of the story of the pears and the delight that he found in simply doing the evil, the transgressive. But in the years that we've taught you about concupiscence in our program, I've also warned you that one day it's going to mean something else, and that you'll have to be ready for that day. And here we are. The Latin word concupiscence by itself doesn't have anything to do with original sin. It just means desire. It's cupio, the verb cupio there at the center, with the con prefix of wanting to be with, wanting to make it yours, sort of an all-encompassing, wrap your arms around it kind of desire. It doesn't have any connotations of evil. In fact, it really is just, if we look at the chart, it's the same kind of thing that fear is. It's an S reaction, an animal reaction. In Article 6, we asked, can a strong negative S reaction impair voluntariness? Now what we're asking is, can concupiscence, a positive sense appetite response, can it impair voluntariness? So here, by concupiscence, we just mean something delicious. Donuts, anything that you want at an animal level, as long as it's not a rational appetite. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Could be good, could be bad, but do you want it at a basic animal level? That's all we mean by concupiscence, just desire. So how are we going to actually run the article? For the most part, we're going to do two things. We're going to relate it back to the fear articles. That's what objections 1 and 2 are going to do. And we're also going to try to get some really relatable stories of human experience. And if you can reflect on your basic experience of strong concupiscence, of wanting things, desiring things at an animal level, then this article's pretty easy, I think. All of the objections matter, but they're not too difficult, again, as long as you can relate to your experience, which young people not necessarily as good at. Objection 1 is the vaguer objection. It would seem that concupiscence causes involuntariness. Just as fear is a passion, so is concupiscence. Fear causes involuntariness to a certain extent, therefore concupiscence does too. Hopefully you recognize the language of question 6, Article 6. All the objector is claiming is that fear and desire are generically the same. They're the same kind of thing. They're both passions. And so whatever we said about fear, we should say about concupiscence. And if the answer in Article 6 was simply voluntary, involuntary in a certain respect, that's what we should get here as well. Now, obviously, Aquinas is going to argue against this. We always go in counter to the first objector. And that means, practically speaking, we're going to have to look for a way in which fear and desire are different. That'll be Aquinas' task. But we should also notice, maybe just to appreciate for a second here, that Aquinas is going to end up arguing the simpler position, not the subtler one. In some ways, the objector is trying to take the subtle position of, well, it kind of is and it kind of isn't. And Aquinas is going to say, no, it's actually just voluntary. It's not involuntary in any way. You don't often see Aquinas doing it that way. That's objection 1. Objection 2, I think, is a stronger objection. It's a little bit more obviously tying it into fear beyond the, well, they're the same kind of thing objection than the first one. Further, just as the timid man, through fear, acts counter to that which he proposed, so does the incontinent through concupiscence. Fear causes involuntariness to a certain extent, therefore concupiscence does so also. So again, we're linking to fear, This time, I think a little more obviously. In the fear article, we told a story of the sailors doing something they don't really want to do. They do something counter to what they had proposed originally. Well, they want to sell the cargo, but there's a storm and now they don't. But it seems like we can tell a similar story with concupiscence. Now, he uses the language of timid and incontinent, which I think here we only need to know that the timid person is one who acts out of fear, that yields habitually to fear, so that they will act according as they are afraid on a habitual basis. And incontinent is the same, but with pleasure. Incontinent literally means you cannot contain yourself. You can't say no to yourself. So the incontinent person habitually yields to concupiscence, to pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure. And what we all, I think, can see in our experiences is resolving not to do something, not to yield to something, but then in the face of temptation, failing and regretting it. So you could tell lots of stories. This is the kind of thing we should do in class, I think, multiply examples. But as a simple one to get started, imagine trying to lose weight somehow, some kind of diet, an athlete trying to cut weight by the end of the week, perhaps. And so you resolve to cut out junk food and bad carbs, empty calories, that sort of thing. And so you don't want to do things like eat donuts, but then you're presented with a box of fresh Krispy Kreme donuts hot off the line. And now you in one sense don't want those at all, but there's another important way in which you really do. Well, at the rational level, you don't want them. You have resolved not to eat them. But now you have this animal reaction fighting in the other direction. And the problem is we all have the experience of yielding. And we end up doing a thing we don't really want to do. That should sound very similar to the fear story of throwing the cargo overboard, when we break our resolutions and regret them. This is a good objection. Objection 3 also relies on an experience reflection, maybe a little bit harder to think through. Knowledge is necessary for voluntariness. Concupiscence impairs knowledge. Now he's going to cite Aristotle here, but we're going to change this in the explanation. For the philosopher says that delight, or the lust of pleasure, destroys the judgment of prudence. Therefore, concupiscence causes involuntariness. Prudence is a subject that we will discuss extensively in the spring, but it is yet again a habit. And as I'm constantly ranting about in these videos, not a fan of Aquinas borrowing from the future, talking about habits before we've really gotten to the material. We'll spend several weeks in January, from the beginning of the spring semester, talking about prudence, and in some sense, directly or indirectly, for the entirety of the spring semester. It's an enormously important topic. However, I don't think you need to know anything about prudence and the way intemperance undermines it and the 4 specific ways that Aquinas has in mind. We'll do that in the future. All you really need to be able to do is relate to the experience, I think, of having a strong desire, having a strong concupiscence that makes you stop paying attention to things, that narrows your vision. You want something so much, you stop thinking straight. You stop thinking rationally about it. You ignore things. You miss things. And if we're suddenly not knowing things, well, what happens if we no longer have knowledge of the end? That's fundamental for the voluntary act. And so if voluntariness can take that away, well, then we don't have voluntariness anymore. So it's a good objection as well. How are we going to work in the other direction? Well, the sed contra, St. John of Damascus, the involuntary act deserves mercy or indulgence and is done with regret. Neither of these can be said of that which is done out of concupiscence. Therefore, concupiscence does not cause involuntariness. We should say a few things about the Damascene quote. We're giving some kind of definition of the involuntary or a proposition about it. We should clarify, though, mercy or indulgence here. We don't mean that we're forgiving someone for something that they're responsible for, right, in the way that Jesus commands us to forgive, the way that we're supposed to be peacemakers, have mercy, helping to reconcile when someone has really wronged us. Here we actually just mean when someone has done something but not voluntarily, we should recognize that and let them off the hook for it. It's not your fault, not holding them accountable for things that they're not really responsible for. That's the sense of mercy or indulgence. If you could show you did this against your will, then it would no longer be fair to hold you accountable for it. That's the idea of mercy or indulgence. The regret angle we've seen before, that was in Article 5. That's where one of the main features of the involuntary. Part of what it means for something to be counter to the will is that when it happens, you're sad about it because you haven't gotten the thing that you willed, or the thing that you willed has been frustrated somehow. So that's what we mean by the involuntary act. According to Aquinas, none of that is true of acts done out of concupiscence. So we're actually just negating the proposition. If an act done out of concupiscence does not deserve mercy or indulgence and is not done with regret, then it's not involuntary. He doesn't give us any reason to think it. He just claims it here. So we're left to supply this one on our own. And I think maybe we could argue about this sort of thing in class, try to elaborate, but I'll give us a story to start. You could imagine some sort of court case, pleading before a judge, trying to give some defense so that you are not found guilty of a theft. You could have a defense that shows it was involuntary, right, somehow, or that you acted under duress. But imagine a defense, which sounds like it would only happen in a comedy show. Imagine a defense where you said to the judge, Your Honor, I can explain. You can't possibly hold me responsible for this. Okay, tell me why. Your Honor, I stole it because I really wanted it. And obviously the skeptical judge is not going to be too impressed by this defense. And you say, no, Your Honor, you don't understand. I really wanted it. This is no defense at all. And what Aquinas is saying is that it's not just that we don't accept that as a defense, it's that we shouldn't. It's a terrible one. That's not true. It's not the case that you literally couldn't help yourself. It's that you didn't help yourself. And so when we ignore this sort of excuse, when we laugh at it, we are right to do so. Still, it's the kind of thing that we want to talk about more in the Respondio. So in some sense, we want to establish this idea rather than just draw on it. And we could fight about it more in class. Now, the Respondio is a bit funny. It's very brief. The entire text of the Respondio is there on the screen. And I think it might be the shortest response that we read all year. It's very close if it's not. And the reason it's brief is we've already said the answer. Concupiscence doesn't cause involuntariness. On the contrary, it makes something voluntary. For a thing is said to be voluntary from the fact that the will is moved to it. Well, concupiscence inclines the will to desire the object of concupiscence. Therefore, the effect of concupiscence is to make something to be voluntary rather than involuntary. Hopefully you can see or hear rather in object of concupiscence, the appetible object. This is nothing other than question 6, article 1, objection 1, appetible objects outside of us moving us. And Aquinas' reply to that, in reply to objection 1. Not every principle is a first principle. There's a new beginning, all that stuff. So if you understood Article 1, you already know the answer. We've just come full circle. We're saying the same things, just from a slightly different perspective. So maybe this way of saying it helps you understand Article 1, or the other way around. If it turned out that concupiscence caused involuntariness, then question 6, Article 1 is wrong, and we could have stopped ethics on the first day. So you just have to go back and rethink Article 1, or combine them. Combine the two articles, look at them, compare them, and that will get you the basic answer here. We just have objects moving us. This is the very paradigm by which we explained the very first article of the year. And that's it. It's time to look at the replies. Now, replies to objections in Aquinas, sometimes they're bonus material, and sometimes they don't matter very much. But in this case, all 3 replies build in an important way on the response. So the Respondio itself is a little thin because we elaborate further in the replies to the objections. And they're all quite interesting, I think. So, reply to objection 1, recall objection 1 was fear and concupiscence are both passions. They're the same. We should get the same answer. The difference, however, is that fear regards evil, concupiscence regards good. And right away we have to pause and not get confused about good and evil, because we're not talking about moral good or evil, or shame on you, or law breaking or whatnot. We haven't defined good and evil in that sense yet. We're still working toward that in this class. This is nothing other than the first line of the convertibility argument that I taught you for the first time in Form 3. Again, almost exactly 2 years ago. Good, in the very beginning of the convertibility argument, the good is what all desire. It just means to be the object of appetite, the object of desire. And evil, the reverse, a thing I don't want, or that is unwantable, or that is contrary to appetite. And that's all he elaborates on in the second sentence. Evil, in this sense, is counter to the will, whereas good harmonizes with the will, because the will is an appetite, and evil means not appetible, and good means appetible. Therefore, fear has a greater tendency than concupiscence to cause involuntariness. We regard the objects of fear and concupiscence differently. We regard one as good for us, and the other as not good for us. And that's the difference. That's why we don't get the same answer. I do think possibly he's confusing the issue a little bit with that third sentence, the conclusion. Fear has a greater tendency than concupiscence. That is a magis quam construction in Latin, but I'm not sure if that's the best way to say it. Maybe it is, but maybe that's worth arguing about in class a little bit. I think reply to objection 2 is clearer and avoids that. So this one, again, very similar to reply to objection 1. He's going to still use that good-evil distinction. He who acts from fear retains the repugnance of the will to that which he does, considered in itself. And repugnance of will there is evil. That's all we mean there. You don't want it. When the sailors threw the cargo overboard, in the moment they're throwing it overboard, there's still an important way in which they still don't want to do it. But simply speaking, they do will it because they want to live. It's different with concupiscence. He that acts from concupiscence, the incontinent person, does not retain the former will, whereby he repudiated the object of his or her concupiscence. The will is changed, so that he or she desires that which previously was repudiated. This one is easy to get tripped up on, and definitely something we should talk about in class. You should challenge this one. This is why I say it down here on the left side. It's a great example to challenge on reflection. Aquinas is claiming that the story of yielding to concupiscence is different. What you end up doing, there's a time beforehand you don't want to do it, and maybe after you don't want to do it, although maybe not. Could go either way. But in the very act of willing it, in the moment that V moves, you are in fact simply willing it. There is no sense, there's no relevant sense, not for Aquinas, in which you are not willing it. And that's a pretty interesting claim, and maybe something we should fight about it a little bit, something we should fight about some. Accordingly, that which is done out of fear is in some sense involuntary, because at the moment of willing, there's a really important way you still don't want to do it. But that which is done from concupiscence is no wise involuntary. It doesn't work that way at all, because it's not counter to what he desires now. But with the timid man, the person who's afraid, they act counter to what they want, even in the moment they're doing it. There is a change of mind that it works differently than it did in Article 6. It's a challenging reply. That should reward some additional thought. We can fight about it in class. Finally, reply to objection 3. It's a little longer, so I've broken it into 2 slides. Remember, the objection was that concupiscence destroys the knowledge necessary for voluntary action. We don't have knowledge at the end, can't have voluntariness anymore. So first, if concupiscence were to destroy knowledge altogether, as happens with those whom concupiscence has rendered mad, it's a mentes in Latin, I think, mindless, it would follow that concupiscence would take away voluntariness. It would. But properly speaking, it would not result in the action being involuntary, because in things bereft of reason, there is neither voluntary nor involuntary. So it would actually be non-voluntary, which we saw for the first time in Article 3, and which will feature very prominently in Article 8. I do think it's worth considering what cases he has in mind here. Obviously, he thinks that people can be driven mad by concupiscence, but he doesn't really give a treatment of it here. I might propose something like extreme limit cases, starvation, giving food to a man literally on the brink of death by starvation, or water to someone literally on the brink of death by dehydration. The eating or the drinking in that case may well not be voluntary, or there's just no reasoning. There's no reasoning involved there. Maybe the animal programming just takes over, might be a way to try to say it. Maybe. Maybe not. And maybe there are other cases. Maybe it doesn't have to be an extreme case of biological limitation. Maybe it's something else. I'd be interested to hear proposals for other cases here. But assuming it's true, assuming we can have limit cases where concupiscence can be that intense and knowledge really is obliterated, it seems like we should be able to apply that back to Article 6. Why didn't Aquinas consider the possibility that fear could do this? That you could have people be so afraid that what they do is neither voluntary nor involuntary, it's non-voluntary. Is that a miss? Talk about it in class, perhaps. Maybe throw a comment down below. But now, to actually get to the meat of the reply, the actual topic under discussion. Sometimes, I'm going to comment on that word sometimes here. Sometimes in those actions which are done from concupiscence, knowledge is not destroyed because the power of knowing is not taken away entirely, but only the actual consideration in some particular possible act. I think this is a terrible English translation. It's very misleading. Quando que is the word here. The English construction is a little odd. Very clearly, I think, in my opinion, Aquinas means other than those times where knowledge is completely obliterated, other than the weird cases, the limit cases, the extreme cases, in all the other cases, quando que, whenever knowledge is not completely destroyed, which is the normal case, what result do we get? That's the right way to understand that first sentence. So in the normal case of concupiscence, the power of knowing is not taken away entirely, only the consideration in some particular possible act. You overlook things. This is why I use the expression of narrowing your vision. You're not paying attention to the things that you should be paying attention to, could be paying attention to. And that actually gives away the answer, as you can see in the second sentence. The second sentence is just the return of question 6, Article 3. Nevertheless, this itself is voluntary, according as by voluntary we mean that which is in the power of the will, not to act, or not to will, or in like manner, not to consider. So, if you can and should restrain yourself, if you can and should consider something, the fact that you don't, by itself, doesn't make the action involuntary, because you could have, and you should have, because the will can resist the passion, as we shall state later on. Now, obviously, that means that's something we've got to get into later, but for now, we'll just say that Aquinas thinks that the intellect and will have the capacity to say no, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to check myself, and I'm going to not yield to this passion. I'm going to pay attention to the things I should pay attention to. And if I don't, that's on me. And that's reply to objection 3. And that's it for the article. The article is challenging in that it's quick. And in order to get it, you have to understand how it fits in the previous articles, and you have to be able to reflect on some basic human experiences, which Aristotle pretty famously thinks young people are not good at doing. So we'll stop there, and if we need to talk about some of these issues in class, we will. And otherwise, I'll see you then. Bye. God bless.